Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy did not give interviews. She refused magazine covers. She declined visibility where others accepted it. And yet, her face entered the cultural record anyway, captured thousands of times, on sidewalks, at curbs, leaving restaurants, crossing lobbies, always just ahead of the lens. What the photographs could not capture was the shape of her days, how she spent her mornings, what filled her afternoons, how she moved through an ordinary week. The answer changes depending on the year. Between 1994 and 1999, her daily life did not stay the same. It changed, and it changed decisively. She lived two versions of the same life, structured around two very different pressures. What follows is a close look at both of them. The years in question fall into two distinct phases, and they cannot be understood the same way. The first phase begins in 1994 and runs into the early weeks of 1996. During these years, Carolyn was director of publicity at Calvin Klein, living in Manhattan, first single, then privately involved, her fame still peripheral to the broader culture. She moved through the city with a structure built around her work. Early mornings, long hours, a wardrobe that echoed the aesthetic of the company she served. The second phase begins in the spring of 1996, when she left Calvin Klein, and extends through the summer of 1999. It encompasses her marriage to John F. Kennedy Jr. that September, and the 3 years of Tribeca life that followed. In this phase, her daily structure dissolved. The scaffolding of work gave way to a different kind of structure, shaped almost entirely by the presence of the press. Both phases were tightly held. The first set of rules came from her. The second came from the cameras. Carolyn left her apartment early. 7 o'clock was not unusual. Michael Bergen, the Calvin Klein model she was seeing through part of these years, later wrote in his memoir that she could get ready in 7 minutes flat. Shower, dress, face, out the door. At this point, she was still largely unknown outside the fashion industry. Colleagues who saw her arriving at the Calvin Klein offices on West 39th Street noted the consistency of it. She was almost always the first one in. A cab from downtown, a coffee already waiting on her desk. By the time the rest of the publicity department filtered in around 9 or 9:30, she had already worked through the morning's faxes, laid out the day's fittings, taken the first calls from the stylists and assistants handling the actresses who would be wearing Calvin Klein that week, and made a second cup. By the time the city around her began its real day, she was already inside hers. She lived in Manhattan, unmarried, in the last stretch before her life became public property. There was, in those mornings, a kind of anonymity she would never recover. She could walk to a coffee shop. She could wait at a crosswalk. She could be seen without being recognized. For the rest of her life, she would never move through a city unrecognized again. Those mornings belonged to her. By the mid-1990s, Carolyn's look had become austere, intentional, unshakably consistent. It ran on a small set of rules. The rules can be stated plainly, because she followed them that way. No nail polish. Fingernails were short and bare. Minimal makeup. Hair in these years was closer to its natural wave, a warmer blonde than the platinum sleekness she would later become known for. A wardrobe built almost entirely in black, white, gray, and ivory. Calvin Klein's slip dresses, Yohji Yamamoto's long coats, Prada in the years when it still meant minimalism. The products were specific. For the face, MAC Studio Fix Powder, which Carol Radziwill later confirmed in her memoir. On the lips, nothing at all most days, and for evenings out a cranberry or a true red, Bobbi Brown Ruby, Face Stockholm Cranberry Veil, MAC Russian Red. On the eyes, usually nothing. The brows were thin, sometimes overplucked. Skincare was the real investment. Regular facials, Kiehl's, Philip Kingsley's elasticizer for her hair once a week. And her fragrance, per Elizabeth Beller's biography, was Egyptian musk oil from Abdul Karim in New York, a skin-close scent rather than a floral one. It aligned with the aesthetic of Calvin Klein itself, a brand that had built its identity around reduction, negative space, the absence of the unnecessary. An employee in that environment was an extension of the brand. Carolyne did not resist the alignment. She perfected it. What her colleagues remembered was the consistency. She did not have a weekday uniform and a weekend uniform. She looked the same at 9 in the morning and 9 at night. The look was not effortless. It was the product of effort so complete that it appeared effortless. Her body she left alone. She did not work out. When Michael Bergen once asked her about it, she answered, "What's the point?" Her title at Calvin Klein was Director of Publicity. The role encompassed show production, celebrity dressing, and the strategic placement of the brand across the most visible moments in fashion's calendar. She managed dressing rooms at runway shows. She handled requests from stylists and the actresses they worked for. She organized fittings, pulled garments, coordinated appearances, and sat at the center of a logistical operation that from the outside resolved into nothing more than a well-staged event. A typical weekday fell into a known shape. Mornings were for fittings. Clients came through the studio for premieres and press appearances. Annette Bening, Gwyneth Paltrow, Diane Sawyer among them. A rack of that season's pieces wheeled in. The designer's vision fit to a specific woman's frame for a specific red carpet. Lunch was at her desk, standing, or skipped entirely. A salad, a yogurt, a coffee. Rarely more. Afternoons turned toward press calls, show prep, and the steady management of the many small fires that arrived on any given day. Cigarettes between meetings, on the sidewalk outside the building, in the small window of time between one decision and the next. The work was long. By 6, the office was thinning. She stayed. During the weeks before the collections, she stayed until 10 or 11, sometimes past midnight, running through show lineups, checking final fittings, walking the producers through the order of looks one more time before the lights went up. A car service home in the small hours, the city briefly quiet for the first time since her mourning. It was work that demanded a temperament that could absorb missing garments, last-minute alterations, difficult personalities, a designer's late changes of mind. It asked of whoever held the role a particular kind of poise, the kind that could refuse a celebrity without making a scene. Carolyne was that person. Her instincts with people were not soft. She read a room quickly, and she did not waste her assessments. Those who worked beside her in those years describe a woman of striking composure. She did not chatter. She did not overshare. She was warm when warmth was called for, and silent when silence served better. Her voice was lower than most people expected. Her humor was dry. Her read on the mood of a room was unusually quick. Her professionalism was total. Her loyalty to the people she trusted was absolute. She did not repeat what she heard. She did not appear in the gossip columns because she did not feed them. This mattered professionally. It meant that actresses allowed her into rooms they would not allow others into. It meant that Calvin Klein himself could rely on her discretion in matters he would not trust to a publicist with a looser tongue. Her silence, inside a loud industry, was a form of authority. In this first phase, Carolyne's daily life was organized around structure. The structure was work, and inside the work, a set of rules she had written for herself about appearance, presence, and speech. The rules were strict. They were also, in the most important sense, hers. She had chosen them. She maintained them. She lived inside them by her own decision. Everything that happened to her in the phase that followed would test it. It was during these Calvin Klein years, sometime in 1994, that Carolyn met John F. Kennedy Jr. The relationship was private at first, then less private, then, by 1995, subject to the kind of steady speculation that precedes any genuine public attention. The tabloids began to notice. The photographers began to wait. In the early months of 1996, Carolyn left Calvin Klein. She did not take another job in fashion. She did not announce a next step. That September, she married John in a small ceremony on Cumberland Island, Georgia, in a chapel lit by candles before a handful of guests. The woman who walked out of that chapel and into a new life in Tribeca was the same woman. What changed was not her, but what the world demanded of her. John had bought the loft at 20 North Moore Street in Tribeca in 1994 for about $700,000, a top-floor space in a 19th-century cast-iron building bought before he and Carolyn were seriously together. Carolyn moved in with him in the summer of 1995. It was, by the standards of the neighborhood in those years, a serious piece of real estate. A full floor, high ceilings, white walls, tall windows that faced the street. The bedroom had no curtains or shades. It was a detail that, read in retrospect, carries a charge, though at the time it read only as design. The sidewalk was the problem. Photographers learned the address within weeks of Carolyn moving in with him. By 1997, it had become an established post. On any given morning, there were men across the street with long lenses. By afternoon, there were more. Her movement through the city was tracked, photographed, catalogued. If she took a cab, the cab was followed. If she walked, the walk became a sequence of frames. This was not occasional. It was daily. And it did not ease. Inside all of this, Carolyn's life was missing the single element that had organized the previous 2 years. A job to go to. There was no office, no 8 o'clock arrival, no calendar of shows to produce, no celebrity fittings to run, no fashion season to bend her weeks around. The scaffolding that had given shape to her mornings and afternoons in the Calvin Klein years was simply gone. What replaced it was looser and less her own. Mornings at the loft with John before he left for the offices of George magazine in Midtown, usually on his bike, coffee on the couch, newspapers, a walk with Friday, the Canaan dog John had bought in 1995, who by now was Carolyn's too. Afternoons of errands close to home, gourmet garage on Broome Street for groceries, fish, greens, olive oil, the basics of the dinners they ate at home, hair appointments at Frederick Fekkai on Fifth Avenue, the dry cleaner, the flower shop. The hair by now was different too. The natural wave of the Calvin Klein years had been smoothed out, the blonde lightened, the platinum version of her now fully in place. Phone calls, often to her sister Lauren, who worked downtown at Morgan Stanley, reading on the couch in the loft through the long, late afternoons, evenings either at home with a simple dinner and a bottle of wine opened when John came home, or out with their small circle. Bobbi's on Hudson Street, the Odeon on West Broadway, Tribeca Grill on Greenwich. The staff at each of these places knew them and knew how to seat them. A corner table, away from the windows, away from the door. What filled the spaces in between was the street outside the door. A life under that kind of surveillance requires small, continuous adjustments, and she made them. She told Carol Radziwill that 7 in the morning was the only time she could leave the loft without a photographer already on the curb. She used service entrances where the building allowed. She timed her exits to minimize the distance between the door and whatever car or cab was waiting. She walked fast, sunglasses on, head angled slightly down, never engaging the cameras and never looking directly at them. Her clothing stayed pared down because pared down gave a tabloid the least to work with. In 1994, she had dressed to embody an aesthetic. By 1998, she dressed to refuse a narrative. Inside the loft, the habits of her earlier life persisted. The space was on the top floor of a 1921 cast-iron warehouse, exposed brick. The afternoon light moved across the white walls for the length of a long afternoon. She kept to a small social circle, the handful of friends she had known for years. Carol and Anthony Radziwill, John's cousin and his wife, who lived nearby and whose evenings often overlapped with hers. Rosemarie Terencio, John's assistant at George, whom Carolyn had taken to early and continued to rely on. Hamilton South, from the fashion world, one of the few people from that period she still saw regularly. She smoked. She read. In the summer of 1999, she acquired an orange Apple iMac G3 and set up an email address through Mindspring, an internet provider that her friend Carol Radziwill, years later, described as considered slightly edgy at a time when most of the country was on AOL. She was still learning to use email in those last weeks of her life. The loft itself was furnished with real attention. Carolyn purchased an Edward Wormley dining table from the Wyeth Gallery on the Upper East Side, a lacquered mahogany piece from the mid-1950s, and paired it with 6 Wormley chairs upholstered in Larson fabric. She was, in the patterns of her private life, a collector, a reader, a woman who cared about rooms and the objects inside them. What she refused, still, was publicity. She did not give interviews. She did not grant profiles. She did not explain herself, not to Vogue, not to Vanity Fair, not to the friendly reporter with the guaranteed, sympathetic angle. The demand for access only grew. Her answer did not change. What the public saw and what her friends saw were 2 different women. The tabloids gave her icy, pale, remote. Her friends gave her warm and funny, generous with attention, quick with a perfectly timed quip. The first thing she said to you when you walked in, Rosemarie Terencio later remembered, was almost always, "How are you doing?" Carol Radziwill, in a single sentence, called her a protector. Most weekends the couple left the city. John piloted his Piper Saratoga from Essex County Airport up to Cape Cod or Martha's Vineyard, the water out the window on the way down. On the vineyard, they stayed at Redgate Farm, Jackie's 340-acre estate in Aquina, purchased in 1979 and assembled over the years that followed. A cedar-shingled house designed by Hugh Newell Jacobson. Rooms lined with books, multi-paned windows that looked out over the Atlantic. In Hyannis Port, they slept at the family compound on Marchant Avenue and walked the lawn down to Nantucket Sound. One summer weekend in 1997, she and John were photographed kayaking off the compound beach. Some other weekends they drove to Sagaponack, to a small Hamptons cottage John had rented called Sea Song, which they shared with Anthony and Carol Radziwill. These were the places she could be outside without calculating, where she could walk on a beach and a camera was not waiting. There is no gentle way to describe what it is to live under constant observation by people whose work is to photograph you in your worst unguarded second. Carolyn described versions of this experience to those closest to her. The textures of life that most people take as given, the ability to buy flowers without being followed, the ability to leave the building without calculating, the ability to cross a lobby unremarked, were gone. The small pleasures of anonymity she had lived inside during the Calvin Klein years, and which she could not have known at the time she was inside them, were now the thing she most lacked. One event made all of it concrete. Princess Diana was killed in Paris on the last night of August 1997, her car chased into an underpass by a pack of photographers. Carolyn had sat near Diana at Gianni Versace's funeral at the Milan Cathedral just over 5 weeks earlier. The news reached the loft that night, and she watched the coverage for hours. Rosemarie Terencio later said Carolyn was horrified. She worried about Diana's 2 sons. She was also, privately, afraid that what had happened in the Pont de l'Alma could happen to John, could happen to her. The night of Diana's funeral, Carolyn and John had dinner at Hyannis Port with Kathy McKeon, Jackie's former personal assistant. Carolyn, who had been quiet most of the evening, opened up. She had been getting into fights on the sidewalk with the photographers who chased her through Manhattan. She had once kicked one. She was, in her own word, terrified of them. After Diana's death, she went out less. In this second phase, the question that shaped every morning was no longer what needs to be done, but who is outside. The habits she had built at Calvin Klein were still there. The composure, the restraint, the care about clothes. Now they were helping her get through a sidewalk. Placed side by side, the 2 phases compose a single portrait. In the first, Carolyn's days were built on the architecture of work. She was director of publicity at Calvin Klein. Her mornings were early, her appearance spare, her professionalism close to absolute. The rules she lived by were her own. She had chosen them, and she maintained them, and their maintenance was visible only to those who worked beside her. In the second, the architecture fell away. There was no office to arrive at. There were instead photographers across the street. Her mornings became calculations. A walk to a restaurant became a route to be planned. Her private life, the one she had built, became the object of an attention she had never sought and could not stop. What remained constant across both phases was the quality that had always defined her. The composure, the control, the refusal to offer herself as a public commodity. What changed was what she was controlling. In 1995, she controlled a look, a team, a calendar, a role. In 1998, she controlled the angle at which she turned from a camera, the door through which she left her building, the number of words she exchanged with a stranger who already knew her name. Her daily life, in other words, was never effortless. It was always constructed. The construction was simply built, in the first phase, to uphold a career and a self, and in the second phase, to defend them. The image that survives her, the woman in the long coat crossing a downtown street, is often read as natural grace. It was not natural. It was the visible surface of a life held together by constant work, lived by a woman who had learned, by necessity, to control what was seen of her. She was, in both phases, a serious person. She worked hard at the life she had. And when the life changed, she worked just as hard at the one that replaced it. That is the thread that runs through all 5 years. Not effortless, not accidental, constructed, sustained, and held.
Thank you everyone so much for watching Cultured Elegance. If you'd love to support the channel, you can become a channel member today by clicking Join at the bottom of the screen. Thank you everyone so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.